Recording time! You tell everybody, hello. Hi, Tired Dad here. Quick question for you. Did God approve of lying in the story of the Midwives in Exodus chapter 1? If you don't know what we're talking about, that's totally okay. But if you finish this video and you still don't know, drink some coffee, watch it again, and improve my watch time. For a brief review, Joseph's father Israel comes down to Egypt, a group of about 70 people. And we see this figure of 70 people starting in Exodus chapter 1 as well as in Genesis 46. However, Acts chapter 7 shows a different number where Stephen is talking to the Pharisees. He gives a figure of 75 as opposed to 70. Why is there a difference in these two numbers? And one commentary I read elaborates on it, and it says there seems to be a contradiction between the 75 souls given in Acts 7 and the 70 mentioned in Genesis 46. So Stephen followed the Greek translation of Genesis 46 and Exodus 1, which was 75. The Hebrew text has 70, indicating nothing more serious than just a different way of numbering Jacob's family. Let's go to Exodus chapter 1 now. So verse 1 starts, "Now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came from Egypt with Jacob. They came each one with his own household: Reuben, Simon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the people who descended from Jacob were 70 people, but Joseph was already in Egypt. And Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the sons of Israel were fruitful, and increased greatly, and multiplied, and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them." Now, for many, the list of names that we just read gets bypassed, as they're deemed to not be super important, but I would love to show you why this is definitely not true. So verse 1 begins with, "Now these are the names of the sons of Israel." And this shows a continuation of the promises that God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we would see that this promise is brought forward in their seed. Now, the names are also listed in order of seniority, where the sons of Jacob's wives are listed before his two concubines. Now, obviously, Joseph was left out as he was already in Egypt. And in verses 5 through 6, it describes the death of the first generation and the multiplication of the generations that follow. Verse 7 gives a fulfillment to God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that he would make them into a great nation. Now, how many exactly did the population grow to? Numbers 1 says that the total number of men 20 years and older was about 600,000. This puts most estimates for the Israelite population to be around 2 million people or so. Now, verse 8 reads, "Now a king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph." Now, what does it mean that he didn't know Joseph? Obviously, he didn't know him personally because Joseph had died a few hundred years before. It could mean a couple of things. So Joseph brought a lot of wealth to the kingdom of Egypt, and the Pharaoh of his day had recognized this to the point where he allowed Joseph and his family to settle in the very fertile land of Goshen. This Pharaoh likely did not understand the Pharaoh of Moses' time. He did not understand the great service that Joseph had done, even though it would have been a significant part of their history. And whether this ignorance is willful or not is not actually stated, but what you do see in the rest of the story is this king has a total disregard for the history of the Israelites and their beliefs. Is that tasty? Now, where does the Egyptian history line up with the history of the Exodus? And the answer to this is not as clear-cut as one might think. So highly intelligent, well-studied, and sincere scholars who believe Scripture to be a historically accurate record have looked at the data and come up with different times, even when assessing the same evidence. So this should give us some pause when we start to look at this. There's little doubt to whether there were Semites in Egypt, and this scenario is found to be quite possible even among the most skeptical critics of the historicity of Exodus. So, for example, Sir Alan Gardner believes the Exodus narratives to be, quote, "no less mythical than the details of creation as recorded in Genesis." But he also acknowledges, quote, "that Israel was in Egypt under one form or another, no historian could possibly doubt. A legend of such tenacity representing the early fortunes of a people so unfavorable an aspect could not have arisen save as a reflection, however much distorted, of real occurrences." There are 5 views that I'm aware of that deal with the dating of Exodus, and I'm going to put those on the screen here. And my goal isn't really to convince you of a particular view here. I'm not going to be able to do justice to each of them, and it would take a long time to explain it. If you'd like to learn more, this book is highly technical. It's about 300 pages. If you like to learn more, go ahead and check that out. Why are there so many views on the dating of Exodus? There's a couple things that make it tricky. For one, Exodus itself doesn't give us enough data to pinpoint exactly where the story of Exodus takes place in Egyptian history. The other issue is that outside of scripture, the nature of the ancient Egyptians, they didn't like to depict events that portrayed them unfavorably. Thus, it actually would be inconsistent with Egyptian history if they included a detailed account of the things that happened in Exodus. What? You're so cute. Huh? So, biblical minimalists who believe... Yes. Biblical minimalists who believe that the Bible... Biblical minimalists... Yeah. Gotta be quiet. Biblical minimalists who believe that the Bible cannot be considered reliable historical evidence will state that, you see, the supposed Moses who authored your mostly fictional book didn't put the name of Pharaoh because it's a folklore, a myth, or a legend. So there's actually a number of problems with this thinking. The reason for not including the name of Pharaoh could be for a few reasons. One of those reasons is a theological reason. The story of Exodus is a story about how Yahweh provides deliverance from physical slavery and, more importantly, redeeming them spiritually from their captivity to sin, giving them a guide to morality and worship. It's not trying to answer the question, which Pharaoh reigned during the time of Exodus. This doesn't mean that Exodus isn't a historical book. It just means that this specific detail wasn't included. So some people might say, this is a very important detail. You're talking about a story where you have a Pharaoh who thinks he's some kind of deity, and then he's humbled by the Hebrew God. How could you not include this as part of your historical account? So this forms a sort of causal fallacy where one assumes that because a detail is missing, therefore the story must not be historical. And this seems like a little bit of a reach to me. I think you're getting a little tired of sitting. All right, I think she's probably done for now. Just because she left doesn't mean you get to stop watching the video now, okay? So stick with it. We're going to get to some really cool stuff here. So, Dr. James Hoffmeyer, a biblical maximalist, Egyptologist, and Old Testament scholar, writes out some really interesting things from his book, Israel in Egypt. So he says, another factor that might account for the absence of Pharaoh's name in the Exodus narratives is that it was normal in New Kingdom inscriptions not to disclose the name of Pharaoh's enemies. He then lists a number of examples, which I'll throw on the screen here, and he says, foreign kings who are defeated, deposed, or killed are often unnamed, despite the fact that they were rather prominent kings. Their names are not given. These statements are quite significant when you cross-reference this with Acts chapter 7, where Stephen says, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was proficient in speaking and action. Dr. Hoffmeyer continues, the omission of Pharaoh's name in the Exodus story, I suggest, was deliberate. For the Hebrew writer, there was good theological reasons for this silence. The reader learns the name of God Yahweh and his power as the Exodus story unfolds, whereas his arch rival, Pharaoh, remains anonymous. A nice piece of irony. I just find it so interesting that Egyptians didn't record the names of their felled enemies, and this is a potential reason as to why the name of Pharaoh is not included in the book of Exodus. Anyways, going back to the book of Exodus, we left off in verse 8, which said, Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, otherwise they will multiply, and in the event of war, they will also join those who hate us and fight against us and depart from the land. So they appointed taskmasters over them to oppress them with hard labor, and they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they dreaded the sons of Israel. Pharaoh speaks of the Israelites here as a people, which is also the first time they are ever referred to as such. Pharaoh also describes them as a threat to national security, and he also sees their potential as an economic asset in slavery. So this slavery was to be so rigorous and difficult that it would control the original population problem. He wanted to break the minds and hearts of the Israelite people so that they would not want to bring children into the world that they lived in. This idea is further evidenced in verse 12 as it shows that the more the Israelites were oppressed, the opposite actually happened. Children, throughout Scripture, are viewed as a gift from God. This is one of the main main reasons why they're a target of the kingdom of darkness. Here's a quote that's rather interesting that really illustrates this point, but I actually want you to guess who wrote it as we're reading through it here. So the quote is, "The state must proclaim the truth that the child is the most valuable possession a people can have. In this matter, the state must assert itself as the trustee of the millennial future, in face of which the egotistic desires of the individual count for nothing and will have to give way to the ruling of the state." So if you had guessed this quote came from Mein Kampf, written by Adolf Hitler, you were correct. So few things please the kingdom of darkness more than espousing false worldviews to children or having them killed. And we see this here in America, as those who hate God do all that they can to destroy the family unit and kill the innocent before they're born through abortion. And if you would like to learn more about some of the arguments against abortion, I would invite you to check out this video or this book if you're looking for some more detailed explanations. Assuming that you have some background in this area, I'd like to share one of my favorite arguments, and this argument is the building demolition analogy. So this argument is only useful if you've already established to the pro-choice person that you're talking to that if the fetus is a human, abortion is wrong. So most pro-choicers haven't touched any books on embryology, and they usually take a slightly agnostic approach to this, to where they'll say, maybe 70, 80, 90% certainty that the fetus is not a human. And I like to make them put a percent on it because we'll use it later. So the analogy goes like this. You have a building that needs to be torn down, and you haven't checked to see if anyone has left the building. Do you push the button that sends the entire building crashing down? Would you do it if you were 90% sure that no one was in there? Then I like to take it one step further by asking them, as science and ethical philosophy continues to progress in this area, are you willing to be guilty by association if, in the future, you are proved wrong and abortion is actually murdering an innocent child? This really makes them rethink their agnosticism and demonstrate the dangers of this way of thinking. Anyways, back to Exodus. Verses 13 and 14 say, "The Egyptians used violence to compel the sons of Israel to labor, and they made their lives bitter with hard labor and mortar and bricks and all kinds of labor in the field, all their labors which they violently had them perform as slaves." These verses continue to show the depths of the immorality of slavery, but Pharaoh wouldn't stop here, as we see in the verses following with the story of the midwives. It says, "Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Siphrah, and the other was named Puah. And he said, 'When you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall put him to death, but if it is a daughter, then she shall live.' But the midwives feared God, and they did not do as the king of Egypt has commanded them, but let the boys live." Here, we see Pharaoh commanding for the execution of all male Jewish babies by employing the Hebrew midwives. Some have objected to this point of the story, saying, how could two midwives take care of the hundreds of thousands of women? And the answer to this is Egyptian society was highly organized, making it highly likely that Pharaoh was speaking to the leaders of the midwives. The next question that's often raised on this passage is, how could God bless the Hebrew midwives for not only disobeying their governmental authority, but also lying about showing up late to the birth? After all, Romans 13:1 tells us, "Every person is to be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God." Also, Proverbs 12:22 says, "Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord." How can the actions of these two midwives be justified? The conditions for this moral dilemma was unavoidable for these two midwives. They were either to lie to the Hebrew mothers that they were supposed to help, or they had to lie to Pharaoh. Some have wondered whether the lie was necessary or not to prevent the killing of further innocents, and scripture itself doesn't elaborate on it, but I think it's worth mentioning that these midwives would also have to lie again to the Hebrew mothers, as they were supposed to help birth these baby boys. Another story that presents a similar dilemma is the story of Rahab when she lies to protect the Israelite spies. In this case as well, there seems to be a good ending to the story, as she has faith in God, saves the spies, and Rahab is actually adopted into the lineage of Jesus. Still here, the Bible doesn't honor her lie per se, it honors her faith. The real question then comes, is it ever permissible to lie as a Christian? Now, most people would like to give a quick answer on how they feel about this, but is this view that you have consistent with Scripture? There are actually 6 basic views on this, and for a more detailed approach, I would encourage you to check out this book, and that's where I'm going to be taking a lot of the content for the rest of the video moving forward. It's a phenomenal book. I actually think every Christian should read it, and at a minimum, read the second half of it. It's a phenomenal resource and worth having on your bookshelf. I'm going to briefly run through these different views. There's 6 of them, but I'm mostly going to spend time talking about the one that I hold. The first view is the antinomian view, and that states that lying is neither right nor wrong. Morality is determined on subjective grounds in this view. The second view on lying is the generalist view, where lying is generally wrong, but there are no universal laws. As a rule, lying is generally wrong, but it can be broken in specific cases, and it ends up being sort of an ends justify the means if the ends are good. The third view on lying is the situationist view, and this view holds that lying is sometimes right, but there is only one universal law, and love is the only absolute law, and lying may be the most loving thing to do, especially in the case to save a life. Everything other than love is relative. Now, the fourth view on lying is the unqualified absolutist view. This view holds that lying is always wrong, and there are many non-conflicting laws. There are absolute moral laws, and none of them should ever be broken. The truth should always be told, and the ends never justify the means, even if the ends are desirable. This would mean that lying to save a life is never permissible. Now, the fifth view on lying is the conflicting absolutist view. This view holds that lying is forgivable and there are many conflicting laws. This view recognizes that we live in a fallen world and absolute moral laws can run into conflict. In these cases, the more moral route is to take the lesser evil. In practice, this would be lying to save a life, then asking for forgiveness, as we are still guilty for the lie. So the sixth view, which is actually the view that I hold, is the graded absolutist view. This view would say that lying is sometimes right, and there are higher laws and there are lower laws. Now, before anyone gets the pitchforks, let me explain. Graded absolutism holds that there are laws that are higher than other laws. Therefore, we must obey the highest law when there are two in conflict, as opposed to choosing the lesser evil. This view is different than the last view in that the lying to save a life, to preserve a life, is not a sin, as opposed to having it actually be a sin that needs to be forgiven. They are exempt from the law, but there is no exception to the law. The law stays the same, but they are exempt due to the unavoidable circumstance. Osteen is largely credited for forming early theories in graded absolutism, but the arguments for this view come from Scripture. The core elements of graded absolutism involve these points. The first is that there are higher and lower moral laws. Jesus mentions the weightier matters of the law in Matthew 23. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are things that you should have done without neglecting the others." Jesus also mentions the least and the greatest commandment. Matthew 5 says, "Therefore, whoever nullifies one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven." 1 Corinthians chapter 13 also speaks of the greatest virtue, saying, "But now faith, hope, and love remain, these three, but the greatest of these is love." And in John chapter 15 it says, "Greater love has no one than this, than a person who lay down his life for his friends." The idea that all sins are equal is often from a wrong interpretation of James chapter 2, which says, "For whoever keeps the whole law, yet stumbles in one point, has become guilty of all." James isn't saying that you are equally guilty of all points of the law, but rather he is guilty as a lawbreaker, even if he only stumbles in one point, and he's therefore guilty. Now, you may be wondering, when is it permissible to lie? There are a few conditions that must be made in order for this to happen. The first is that the moral dilemma must be unavoidable. In the example of the Midwives or Rahab, I think it would be very reasonable to say that these situations were unavoidable. We don't know this for sure. One alternative explanation is that they could have stayed silent as an alternative to lying. Even though this may seem plausible to some, it doesn't seem reasonable, as Pharaoh would have demanded an answer. Additionally, even silence could lead to death, as in the case of Rahab. To put it in terms of a more modern example, a husband could promise to be on time for dinner to his wife, but along the way he has to save someone's life and is now late. Obviously, this is an extreme example, but it's really one of the only practical scenarios where this could be applied. This ability to lie as a Christian won't be applied very often, as lying is still a very evil thing to do. There are just very unique circumstances as laid out in Scripture where a higher law must be followed over a lower law. This also requires a good knowledge of Scripture, because what you don't want to do is make your own list of laws that you feel are higher or lower, and to do that is really the opposite of what I'm talking about. This isn't a subjective system of morals. It is absolute as it comes directly from God. This view also helps us understand the cross. Christ suffers that we may be saved. If mercy and love are higher moral values than justice, then what Jesus did on the cross would have been a gross injustice. However, God cannot be unjust, and Jesus comes in as a willing sacrifice himself, which is what grants us Christians their justification in the sight of God. For more on why Jesus had to die on the cross and why suffering exists in this world, I would invite you to check out this video that we've actually already put on about this subject. Now, I'm not going to address all the common objections to this view just for the sake of time, but one common objection is, how can lying come from the nature of God as truth? And Norman Geisler writes a really good response to this. He says, very simply, the answer to this is that lying as such does not flow from God's nature. A lie can never be justified by an appeal to him who is truth. However, while lying as such is never justified, lying to save a life is. But lying to save a life is really an act of mercy, and mercy is an attribute of God. Hopefully it will be said of us what Exodus says about the midwives, but the midwives feared God, and they did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them. Thanks for listening, especially if you made it this far. Hopefully you learned something, and let me know if I missed anything. Next time we'll be covering Exodus chapter 2, which will probably be a couple weeks from this video, just because I'm going to be out of town next week. Thanks for watching.